Hey everyone, I'm Mark MacEachern, an informationist at the University of Michigan. And today's topic is how to do a literature search. I've worked on literature searches for a long time now, and my goal for this presentation would be to distill some of what I've learned over the years in such a way that you would be able to apply it in your own context, to your own searches moving forward. Before we begin, I just want to outline two or three things up front. First is that the way I see it, there are like two different types of searches. There's a clinical search where your goal is to quickly find something relevant to answer a clinical need and then be done with the search. That's one type of search. The other type of search, and the one I'm going to focus on in this talk, is a search to support a research project. Those types of searches require you to be a little more structured and comprehensive in your approach to the search. And the approach that I'm going to talk about is certainly in line with that type of search, probably more so than the former type of search where you're just trying to quickly find something relevant. The other thing I want to mention is that I will focus solely on Pubmed. Pubmed is the predominant health sciences literature database in North America and beyond too. It has most of the clinical journals, important clinical journals and research journals, health sciences research journals, etc. I presume you have some familiarity with the database if you're not quite familiar with it. And the process that I'm describing will then in part rely entirely on Pubmed or be dependent on Pubmed, specifically its syntax. I'm going to use some syntax later in this presentation that is used to help make result sets more optimal. That is entirely dependent on Pubmed. It only works in Pubmed. With that said, the general approach I'm taking will be applicable to other health sciences journal databases. So you can take the approach to other databases, but you might need to use different syntax, or you will need to use different syntax in those other databases. And then the last thing I'm going to mention before I jump into the actual presentation is that I have no conflicts of interest or disclosures to make in relation to anything I'm talking about today. All right, so the process that I'm going to distill is being distilled now into three steps. One is identifying search terms. The second is defining the relationship between those search terms. And the third is qualifying those search terms in such a way to make your result set more optimal. All right, so the first step, identifying search terms. This all presumes you have a topic. You need a topic before you undertake a search, an effective search. So we're going to work with this topic, perinatal parent education programs for fathers. I've chosen this topic because it's a project that I was a part of a number of years ago. And so I can speak to it to some degree of ease and familiarity. All right, so here's our project. It's going to serve our topic. It's going to serve as a backdrop for the rest of our project. Also, my cat is sitting to my right and might make an appearance at some point soon. So just FYI. All right, step one is to identify search terms. The first major step after you have a topic is to break your topic into searchable concepts. Searchable concepts are the concepts you want to search, and you want to search concepts that will be or reflect concepts in the ideal article. So think about your result set and what are the ideal concepts that you want to see in the ideal article. In this case, the ideal concepts that I wanted to see were terms related to fathers, terms related to the perinatal period, terms related to education. And so you could run in Pubmed or any other database a search fathers and perinatal and education and get relevant articles based on that search. And those articles would be good, probably, because the authors have chosen to use those terms in the titles, the abstracts, and other pieces of the citation. So good, but you would by no means be able to say that you ran a comprehensive search or you undertook a structured, thoughtful approach to the search because you're relying entirely on the authors using those specific terms. It's very likely that authors will use slightly different terms to reflect your searchable concepts. In this case, fathers can be referred to as dads more casually, or men, males more broadly, or more neutrally, couple, partner, parent, or the plurals. Perinatal can be defined, or we could search just for perinatal or the hyphenated version of that if we want, or we could be a little more inclusive or specific, depending on whether we're interested in periods of time around the concept of perinatal, either subsumed in it or around it. And the way I would frame that thought process is it possible that data collected during a specific period of time that is not necessarily perinatal or referenced as perinatal period of time, potentially relevant to your study? If so, then you would want to search for those terms explicitly. There goes my cat. The other thing is the other term is education. Now, education is difficult to define search term because education can occur in almost any context. You have educational settings, formal educational settings, a classroom, etc. But then you could also, education can be just a conversation between a father and a health provider. And authors might refer to all those things in various different ways, those different contexts in different ways. They might use education specifically or explicitly, but they might also use terms that we would understand as being education related, but they're not, the authors aren't actually using the term education. So you would have to be mindful of some of these kind of minds, to ensure that you're being comprehensive. And that's step one, essentially identifying search terms. The second step is to define the relationship between those search terms. And you want to define the relationship between those search terms using Boolean operators, ands, ors, nots. There are other operators that will define relationships between terms, but these are the main ones. The two main ones are and or. And will give you the intersection of articles in a Venn diagram kind of way here. So if you have a pool of studies on perinatal and a pool of studies on education, if you and those two pools together with the search of perinatal and education, you will get the articles that fall in both pools. If you or fathers or males together, you would get articles that pull from either pool. Either the authors use the word fathers, or the authors use males, or the authors use both. And if you search for with or, you will get articles that meet any of that criteria. The term not, the operator not, I would encourage you to use sparingly because it's easy to accidentally miss something relevant by using the word not. For instance, in this case, we could run a search fathers and perinatal and education and not mothers, not mothers. That sounds reasonable because we're not interested necessarily in mother-related data or educational interventions, but it's possible that by nodding out mothers, we would miss studies that also collected data related to fathers. Maybe the authors collected both mother data and father data, and the authors mention this in the abstract. They say mothers somewhere in the abstract. And if we just nod out mothers, we'll miss that paper. So you have to be very careful. Only include mothers, or only include not if you're certain that the appearance of the word in the abstract essentially is going to render that article irrelevant. There are a couple of main ways to use not, and that one is to, on this slide, exclude animal studies or alternatively human studies, depending on your need. And then there's also a easy way to exclude pediatric studies. If you're not interested in pediatric studies or adult studies, you can not out one or the other. That brings us to our actual search that we could paste into Pubmed. Now this search is going to form the basis for most of what we talk about here on out. What I've done, notice here that I have connected our synonyms, our synonyms for fathers with or. I've connected our synonyms for education with or, and I've combined our perinatal synonyms with or. And then I've combined these three distinct criteria, sets of terms with and. You use and to combine distinct sets of terms. You use or to combine your similar set of terms. The other thing I want to mention here is that two things. One, once you have this logic in place, you just can keep adding ors to your delight, essentially, until you feel like you're not getting any value by adding more synonyms. Or you can scale them back. If some of these terms don't work well in your search results, you can scale them back. So you can just keep adding ors. By no means is this a comprehensive list of all the terms that can possibly be used to describe each of those concepts, but it's a more thorough list of terms. And this is the format, the logic that an effective search will follow. The last thing I want to mention in relation to this piece of the search, or emphasize here, is the brackets. I haven't mentioned the brackets or parentheses to this point. They're very important when building a search using Boolean operators. It's imperative that you use a rounded set of brackets, parentheses, to nest or group together synonyms. So if you're using or, include those or terms in these rounded brackets. So I've nested and grouped together all of the dad related terms. I've done the same with education. I've done the same with prenatal terms. And then I've combined each of these sets of terms with and. The brackets will tell Pubmed or any database, most databases at least, that set of parentheses terms is one criteria, and the database needs to just pick out one or more of those terms, at least one of those terms, to bring back a result that meets your specified criteria. If you want to empirically test what happens, I encourage you to empirically test what happens to your result sets if you use parentheses or not. And so please paste this search into Pubmed at some point at your leisure, and run it with the parentheses and run it without the parentheses, and see what happens to A, the results, and B, the relevance of the result numbers, and the relevance of the actual individual results. All right, I'm gonna delay for 1 second on this slide. If you can get to this point, if you can develop a search to this point where you're using ands and ors effectively with brackets, you've taken a huge step forward, and you are in a good place to find evidence and run effective searches for the rest of your evidence-seeking career, essentially, barring some significant change in automation in the future. But we can take it one step further by being a little more definitive, explicit. Let's use explicit. We can be a little more explicit in the fields within the database we want to search. So we can actually take advantage of databases, some features in databases, to be a little more precise and explicit in what we're searching for. By default, this search will work in almost any database, and it will bring you back relevant results, but you'll also get a lot of noise because it's going to search for each one of these terms in so many different fields, the database that is, in so many different citation fields. And so we're going to add some database-specific syntax, what I'm calling syntax. You might see it come across referenced as field tags. And that's what we're going to see on this slide. This slide is the appendix, or the supplemental information attached to the article that's forming the backdrop of this paper. You would go to the paper, which was published in Pediatrics 2018, a few years ago. You would go to the methods section. You would see a link to the supplemental information. The supplemental information will include all the searches that were used in the systematic review to bring together the articles that were then, considered for inclusion and then subsequently analyzed. All right, within that appendix, you'll see a search for Pubmed in Pubmed. Now, this was the search that was used in part for this project. What I want to highlight is not so much all of the terms, but the syntax that we attached to each of those terms. You're going to see MH square bracket, you're going to see TIAB square bracket, you're going to see TI square bracket. If you start looking at searches that authors are referencing as part of systematic reviews and in other projects where it's incumbent upon the review team to include the full complete searches, you're going to see this formula, this searching format with this type of syntax. Title abstract, mesh is what MH stands for. MH equals mesh, TIAB equals title abstract, TI equals title. This is us telling Pubmed exactly where we want the database to search each one of those terms. It's a term level decision, and it's applied to every term. And now I'm going to delve into it a little bit more detail. That's where we get to qualifying terms, our third and last step. Again, if you can get to the point where we just were, where we haven't qualified any terms, you've made a huge step and you're in a good position. If you want to take one step further, this is what you will do. First, to understand how we qualify terms, it's important to understand how these databases work. They work by doing two types of searches. They do a keyword search and a control vocabulary search. The keyword search is what you expect to find essentially when you search any sort of resource. You expect a literal search of terms. You type in fathers in Amazon, in Google, in Neva, in Pubmed, you're going to get results where fathers appears. That's your keyword search. You find keywords to include in your search by brainstorming terms that are related to fathers, by looking at other sources of information that might provide you with information about what terms are likely to be used in that context. Could be other articles. And that's where you can read titles and abstracts of papers that are using or referencing a father's population. They might include other terms that you could then use in your own search to further define your keywords, your sections of the search that relate to the keywords. Now, Pubmed to search keywords in Pubmed, you will see often, and I encourage you to use title abstract or title searches. Title abstract would be square bracket title / abstract, as on the slide, or in short, TIAB, and title would just be TI. that will tell the database just to search for your terms in the titles or the abstract, and or the abstracts. Controlled vocabularies are a conceptual search, different from a literal search in that the database is not attempting to literally translate your term into a search. It's attempting to map your search term, connect your search term to a formal set of tags that underlie the database, that the database uses to bring together articles on the same concept. So in theory, every article in PubMed on the father's population will have a mesh term, a medical subject heading, a controlled term, a tag that will indicate or help its algorithm bring back relevant articles for you. It works, so any article, regardless of, let me just rephrase that a little bit here. Any article that deals with the father's population in PubMed would be given a controlled vocabulary term, a tagged term, a mesh term, medical subject heading, that would define that concept. And then no matter how the authors, regardless of the terms the authors are using to describe that concept, whether it's fathers or dads, it would be given the one term, the one tag. PubMed syntax for this is the square bracket mesh or square bracket MH. You can find mesh terms in two ways that I'll highlight. The first is to find articles that are relevant to your project, and then you find them in PubMed, you scroll all the way to the bottom, and if they've been indexed with mesh terms, you'll see a menu that says mesh. You pop it open and you'll see a list of the mesh terms. Again, mesh stands for medical subject headings. It's a controlled vocabulary, the tagging system that PubMed uses to define what articles are about. In this case, we could look at this list of terms because we know this article is relevant, and pull out fathers because fathers is directly related to our topic, our searchable concept. The other place to look is in the mesh database, which is a formal place to look for mesh terms. You could do an online search for mesh database, and your result will likely take you to a PubMed looking page that has a list of all the mesh terms that you can search for. It's a hierarchical system where the broadest concepts are toward the left margin, and then as you become further indented, you get down to narrower terms to the right with some relation, somewhat relation. And that brings us to this slide where we've now incorporated the syntax, the PubMed syntax, the field tags to each of the search terms that we were searching for earlier in on the earlier slides. We've qualified each of our search terms with a specific field, citation field that we want PubMed to search for that term. So we see in this slide, MH, so that's mesh again. So I identified through various means that fathers was the mesh term that PubMed used to describe the father population. So I've included it here. I found through the other means that health education was a mesh term that PubMed used to bring together articles on education, health education. And so I included it here. I found that perinatal care was a mesh term that PubMed used to describe articles that dealt with that kind of period of time. I don't know if perinatal care ultimately is relevant because it's dealing more with care, but I included it for just for the sake of completion here and comprehensiveness. Then I supplemented each of those mesh terms with our keywords. These are, again, the literal search for the terms we type in, the terms we are searching for in the titles and the abstracts. So I want to see any article where dad or dads or fathers are appearing also in the title of the abstract, regardless of whether they're actually given, whether those articles are actually given the mesh term fathers or not. Similarly with education, similarly with perinatal care, sorry. Now, the other thing last thing I want to mention on this slide is I've also chosen not to search for classes, courses in the abstract field. I'm just relying on the title field because those terms in particular, plus some of the others, are so contextual. Like it's used in other contexts. These terms are used in other contexts. Classes of drugs, course of treatment. These terms, if we were to include these terms if we were also to search for these terms in the abstract field, our results will balloon in number, and we will get a lot more noise. Articles that are not relevant because the words class, course, etc. are used in too many other contexts. So we scale it back, focus just on the title to get a smaller number of results where those articles would come into our results set where classes appears in the title. And then most of them probably would deal with education contexts, but if not, we would quickly be able to exclude them because it would be evident from the title that the articles are not dealing with a class education setting. So this, before I jump to the bonus, there's a bonus. In addition to seeing my cat earlier, there's a bonus section to this, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But this is the gold standard that you would want to aim toward if you want to run a really effective search that could support any kind of research project. And once you get to this point where you can use syntax in databases, you can then run really powerful searches in any other context. So I'm able to take advantage of this for clinical questions that come my way as well. This type of searching for clinical contexts as well. So even if the searches I run in it for a clinical question specifically, where we're trying to find evidence to support some clinical decision, the search doesn't necessarily need to be this complex where we have so many terms, but I can take advantage of the fields to help me narrow my results down to a more manageable number, a more manageable and relevant number of results. All right, so here we move to the bonus section. And the bonus section is to get Pubmed to work for you, essentially, and that's by creating alerts. So Pubmed will notify you when articles of interest are entered into the database. And there's 3 essential alerts that I think people like to set up. First, before I get to the 3, to find the alerts, you just have to go to the search box and click on Create Alert. This will allow you to create an alert. Now, anytime you run a search, you'll get that option. So you can go to Pubmed, run the search that we were just running, and say you were interested in being notified of new citations that enter the database after you've run that search. And you just want to be notified of them, so you don't have to keep coming to Pubmed to run the search again and again to get all these new articles. You could run the search once you have it in a fine form, run it, create the alert, set up some schedule upon which you would be notified of new citations, and then get those citations emailed to you. So you can just keep up on the literature that's relevant to your project throughout the time you're interested in the project, essentially. You can also search within journals specifically. So if there's a set of journals you need to keep up on, you can, and a topic of interest, you can combine those 2. You can combine, like, say, COVID in the title within JAMA or whatever journals you're interested in by doing a journal search. You can also set up a table of contents alert. This might be the most useful, so that you would be notified when new issues enter into Pubmed. Pubmed will often get citations before they're more formally broadcasted by the journal's other means, because in press articles are put into Pubmed well in advance of actual publication. So if you have journals, if there are journals you need to keep up with, you can run a journal search once in Pubmed by ordering together all of the journals of relevance, save that search as a create alert, and then you'll be notified on whatever schedule you want to be notified of the new issues as they enter the database. And then it would just be a matter of you reading your email and keeping up on your email at periodic points in time. All right. So with that, thank you very much for your time and attention.